Brian, really good to finally touch base. I really enjoyed your book, and it's got me thinking. So I think we can have a good conversation about that or whatever else comes up too. So thank you.
Thank you. It's awesome to finally be here.
Yeah. So you've had quite a run since this book came out, which is awesome. Congratulations. And I think I was probably introduced to it like a lot of folks, probably through Joe Rogan, but I know Graham Hancock from way back. He came out to the ranch where I do retreats, and I've done recordings in southern Utah. This really unusual, out of the woods place. He came down there multiple times for some retreats, and we got to know each other through that. I mean, we were out looking at caves and cave paintings together with groups, and so it was great to see you connected with Graham.
Thanks for that. He's been a very kind friend, as you can imagine.
Yeah,
Despite the pandemic and not being able to hook up in person, I reached out to him randomly many years ago because I was just blown away by his book Supernatural,
yeah,
which is
amazing.
in some ways a prequel to all of my work. He just goes deep into prehistory, tens of thousands of years, looking at the role of hallucinogens across time and space. Just fascinating stuff.
Did you find, because I know for him, he got a lot of pushback from the mainstream world when he wrote that book and probably continues to do so, which I know is always frustrating, but it was also kind of cool that he was always this countercultural, like, thorn at the side. Did you get the same reaction from your book?
Not really. And that could be a product of just living in different times. It could be a generational difference. It could be the fact that, I largely focused on the classical world. I mean, I do dip into prehistory in one chapter. We go back to Göbekli Tepe, which we
Yeah,
can talk about 12,000 years ago. But I mean, for the
yeah,
most part, like most classicists, as I was trained, I mean, I try and stick to the text and the language of about 2,000, 2,500 years ago. And I'm really trying to focus in on as much as we can tease apart from that time period. So,
yeah.
and we're looking for like hard scientific data and the kind of stuff that survives from antiquity. So, in that sense, I'm kind of surprised in the open mindedness I've met with.
Yeah, because what was the book that crossed over into similar themes way back? Was it The Sacred Cross or Jesus and the Sacred Cross? What's that book called?
Right. So that's John Marco Allegro,
Yeah.
Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. I
Yes.
mean, to put it in one line, there was no historical Jesus, and the entire New Testament is coded language for this Near Eastern fertility cult in which their chosen sacrament was the Amanita muscaria mushroom. So on the spectrum of like crazy ideas, he's John Marco Allegro is a bit further to the left than I am.
Well, that book I know created a lot of waves. At least I heard it did in certain religious communities. But maybe a good place to start here before I start diving into questions and some of these ideas, because I already had things I want to ask you. Would you mind just giving people sort of a top level view of what you're talking about in the Immortality Key?
Sure, we've kind of hinted at it already, I
Yes.
suppose. I mean, it's about drugs. It's a book about drugs. Despite the fact that
It's more than
I've
that. More than that.
it's mainly drugs, and I've never done psychedelics, which is sort of the ironic part of my story. I was really drawn into some of the early scholarship on this stuff. John Marco Allegro being one of them, and then this book that came on my radar, The Road to Eleusis, which came out in 1978. That was one of the better treatments of the potential use of psychedelics by the ancient Greeks, which raises a big question because if you can establish some data for that ritual use of drugs 2,500 years ago among the ancient Greeks, and that's the whole first half of my book, it raises the very intriguing, controversial possibility that some of those rituals, some of that magic, some of those sacraments may have made their way into early Christianity, which was largely Greek speaking. The New
Mhm.
Testament is written in Greek, preached to largely Greek speaking communities. So this is all part of this rather academic subject called the pagan continuity hypothesis. And my whole book is basically trying to figure out how much influence these pagans, these pre-Christian demon worshippers, had on the rise of the world's biggest religion, Christianity.
Yeah, it's a wild thought though, because correct me if I'm wrong. Like if you connect the dots from the Greeks to Jesus, that makes a line also that spreads out, sort of like with India and yoga, Buddhism. It becomes like the roots of the tree of a lot of religion, does it not?
There's a big tree there, and
Big tree.
which is why I try to be careful about tracing those roots too far afield. I do talk about India. I do talk about these other sacraments that were known to exist at the time. Again, going back to 3,000 years, especially in the case of the Vedic civilization. I talk about Soma. I talk about the Kukion in ancient Greece. I talk about the Eucharist of Christianity. And I mean, these all broadly fall under the umbrella of sacraments. And I get very geeky into Indo European language and the connections, the very real connections written about by Harvard scholars between some of the sacraments of the subcontinent and their relationship, if any, to some of the sacraments in ancient Greece. Much further west, obviously, and where this all came from. And I was just always fascinated by this concept of a Eucharist, this concept of consuming God, theophagy, consuming God to become God. It's an idea that has its roots in lots of the world's traditions.
Well, no doubt, and that's why it's. I almost feel like the better question is why wouldn't like it's Eleusinian? Am I pronouncing it right?
Eleusinian, perfect.
Eleusinian mysteries were. Why wouldn't they be some kind of mind altering substance? And only I say that mostly because it goes on today. It's been going on in other cultures for millennia, and as far as we can see, and it is from my own experience very powerful. I mean, it's one of the only things in my own life that cracked the nut of my rationalism and materialism that I grew up in, and I'm not sure that I could have done it another way because that kind of felt experience is so profound. It's not an idea, it's just something. It's like you went to the moon and you came back. I mean, you remember you went to the moon, and I would imagine the way it was written about. Because didn't they say that they would go in? It was sort of like one time, and it was basically they knew now what was behind death in a sense, or what. I mean, to me, it just I don't know what else it could have been. It certainly didn't seem like it was a play, or like it just. I've seen some good plays, but nothing compares. Yeah.
Well, the Greeks saw a lot of good plays too. They're largely
I've
credited with
seen
the
the same
yeah.
plays, yeah, but
Yeah. Sometimes we seem to, I mean, they kind of invented the theater. There at the Theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis. These were skeptical people. Also invented the word for skepticism. So like they wouldn't have been drawn in by a fancy play, which is not to say that there wasn't performance, there wasn't music and dance that were involved in the Eleusinian mysteries, which, by the way, survived for like 2,000 years, right? So from roughly 1500 BC to the 4th century AD. They're around for a long time.
wow,
They're celebrated by the ancient Greeks. After them, the Romans also celebrate them at Eleusis. People like Marcus Aurelius becomes an initiate at Eleusis. So it survives for a long time on the promise that you could go to Eleusis once in your life to drink this magic potion, confront death, and go to the moon. Just
there
like
you
you
go.
say,
Yeah.
it wasn't a metaphor. Something really profound was happening there. In fact, I'll quote a play. I'll quote Euripides. His play, The Ion, talks about the moon. And in this really poetic passage where they're talking about what happens at Eleusis, he talks about this notion of rhythm and how the starry sky of Zeus joins into this dance, this procession that's happening on site at the temple at Eleusis. And the moon joins in this dance. And the 50 daughters of Nereus, who's the sea god, the old man of the sea, they join in the dance. So the sea, the ever flowing rivers, the moon, the sky, everything is dancing in procession, being whipped up into frenzy by whatever happens at this holy site at Eleusis that survived on the promise of finding immortality. You went there to die and to be reborn.
Y yeah, I mean, if something like that went on for 2,000 years, I do have to go on the other side of it and say, "Then why is it such a mystery?" You'd think somebody would be in 2,000 years, someone would be like, "Oh, I'm gonna write this one down," and we aren't very good at keeping secrets as a people, but at the same time, it is vague. It's 'cause it doesn't specify really what it was, and why do you think that is? That it was it sort of like keeping it for the priest class, or was this something that was open to, almost anyone?
That's a great question. I want to keep it relevant to today too, because when you think about something that survives for that long and how it could be maintained in secrecy. So that's a first tell right there. For a civilization that created so much literature and so much
Right.
that keeps classicists and historians busy. For that culture to intentionally preserve an oral tradition
Hmm.
about the goddess of the grain, Demeter, essentially, Mother Earth, we can call her Mother Earth, and her daughter Persephone, who's the queen of the dead, a pretty cool little feminine duo there. I mean, for them to have preserved an oral tradition about their story and why a pilgrim would go to meet them at this place, Eleusis, where this magic potion came from, why this existed in the first place is very strange, and how that secrecy was maintained is very, very strange. I mean, but hints and clues do jump out. There was a hymn that was written to Demeter many years before Plato and the other initiates would make their way there. But then by the 5th century, things start to get interesting, and you hear about all these scandals, these profanation of the mysteries, and people get tired of going to Demeter's temple to celebrate this mystery. And bit by bit, we have one testimony of the mystery being celebrated indoors at a dining room, and something's happening where people are, you
Is
could
that where
say,
everybody died? That was like you said, like 39 of the 42 died, and then 3 days later, the other three died. It's like
That
that's
was
a
that was
party.
that was that was another party. That
Oh,
was
okay,
that was in
different.
honor of the departed comrade of Alexander the Great.
They didn't fuck around. I mean, it seems like if they're like they want to go to the edge and just go over it sometimes.
The Greeks knew how to party, and in an
Yeah.
age before distilled liquor, we're at a loss to describe why their beer and their wine was so strong. And so I spend a long time in the book talking about what beer and wine meant to them, and these were routinely described as these polypharmacy, these composite potions into which all kinds of plants and herbs, possibly maybe even fungi, were mixed to produce different experiences. Wine and beer were very versatile vehicles, and they were sometimes celebrated in these mystery-like settings.
Well, do you think that it's there's an interest in this now? You know how like right now we're going through a psychedelic renaissance of interest and sort of acceptance. We sort of spoke about it at the beginning, how you feel like maybe times are a little bit different. Uh, do you think there's a connection there to like the way we're culturally more interested in this and sort of well, let me just reframe that. Why do you think we're culturally more interested in it now as opposed to not being so before, when this is something that seems to almost be part of human nature
Hmm.
and across cultures? They kind of find their medicine and run with it. Why do you think it is now interesting to like us?
That's it's hard to gauge. I mean, I think like you and I are about the same age. I think we were born into a very weird time in terms of our relationship with drugs. I grew up with Ronald and Nancy Reagan telling me to just say no, and Richard
Yeah,
Nixon a decade before that. I mean, we were born into the war on drugs, which is absurd, inefficient, probably racist, and lots of other things that we could say about it. You have to remember that psychedelics weren't always illegal, including in the United States,
yeah,
and that these things were more widely available, even in the 19th century, especially. You don't see a lot of international drug treaties or prohibitions on drugs until the end of the 19th into the 20th century, especially the beginning of the 20th century. And so for many, many years before that, drugs were part of how we healed, right? And there wasn't necessarily this distinction between really, really bad drugs and good drugs like we have today. It's perfectly acceptable to consume caffeine in the
yeah.
morning and alcohol at night, like I do most days. But then we look at these psychedelics, and even though they're not habit forming, I think they just got tossed into this generalized war on drugs for lots of different reasons that we can explore. But I think the point is that the fog of war is lifting,
Mhm.
and I don't know why that's happening, but I think it began with a reassessment of cannabis over the past 10 years that went very quickly from being completely outlawed in almost everywhere in the US aside from California for medicinal use to now being either medicalized or available for adult use in the vast majority of the states around the country. And I think you're going to see psychedelics take not the same, but maybe a similar path in terms of decriminalization. California, again, at the statewide level, is considering that. You're aware that in Oregon, for example, they're now regulating psilocybin for therapeutic use. I mean, so this is the general trajectory of things, and I just think I don't know. I think maybe it's just a generational shift.
Do you think there's an analogy to the time we're at, sort of this apocalyptic time of things changing, composting, falling apart, and also how the Greeks, if they went through a similar time and the sort of shift in their civilization?
I do think about that. So that one of my favorite parts about Eleusis, which it's perfectly fine if no one's ever heard of that. We're throwing around a lot of concepts, but again, it survives for 2,000 years. In the fourth century A.D., it's finally done away with. And a few decades before that happens, in my book, I talk about this relatively obscure passage where Eleusis is kind of described as the thing that holds the world together, and it's described that way by
Wow.
this guy Praetextatus, who's a Roman. Again, the Romans kept this thing going, and he describes his experience there, and he's trying to defend the mysteries. He's trying to defend the existence of Eleusis in a quickly Christianizing world, right? In the fourth century A.D. And he says that basically, if the mysteries die, if you get rid of Eleusis, that we are going to die. That there is something about that experience at Eleusis that holds the entire world together. And in fact, and you talk about apocalypse, that's a great Greek word. The word that Praetextatus uses to describe what would happen in the absence of the mysteries is abiotos, like biological. Life itself, human life, our species, wouldn't survive in the absence of the mystery. So they very much thought about that experience as the difference between life and death for the planet.
I love that phrase, like we wouldn't survive without the mystery. Because, I think of the mystery with a capital M as the essence of what it means to be alive, like all the contradictions, the conundrums, the paradox, the idea of destiny being a choice, and the things that just, Buddhist koans. It's like that is what it means to be incarnate. And it's really like interesting to me that they had this idea that without that there was no there was no base to stand on in life. Um, I would like you, if you could, though. I want to connect the dots, if because I think there are some dots that you were connecting between the Greeks and Jesus. And what
Hmm.
are the Romans the bridge there?
That's a great question. Are there? Yeah, I think the Romans are the bridge. I say that as a Catholic.
Well, I was thinking of Catholicism and eating the body of Christ and
Hmm.
drinking, and so how that it seems to me like that just is like screaming in your face a connection to uh, this ergot brew that they, it's like it's a vestige of it.
Yeah,
It doesn't
it
have any
screamed.
drugs. But it
Yeah.
seems like it did, or it's at least like a semblance, or somebody higher up would get to, well, we'll get the experience and we'll tell you plebes what it's like. We'll disseminate it for you. But we're still doing that. And it's an interesting ritual.
I think this was the whole tension in antiquity, and it's the tension today. We were just talking about the war on drugs and decriminalization. What is the future of psychedelics going to look like? I don't think we ever had a good answer for that. So we've been talking about Eleusis this whole time. It's government administered. So imagine Washington D.C. inviting thousands of people to the suburbs of where I'm sitting right now to drink a magical potion once a week every fall. That's the equivalent. It was run by these two hereditary families and government administered for 2,000 years. So that was one way. That was one way of inviting people into this, what Professor Ruck calls the culminating experience of a lifetime. And on the other hand, you have this guy Dionysus, equally mysterious, equally maddening. These rites of frenzy and secrecy, largely led by women, by the way. And as people get tired of the formalism of Demeter's temple at Eleusis, there's always Dionysus. And Dionysus are these wine fueled mysteries that largely exist in the forests and the mountains, away from these priestly families. And there's sort of this democratization of these ecstatic fits of frenzy. And you could say heavenly delight. You would drink the wine of Dionysus to become one with Dionysus. And so already you see that tension. Is this the kind of thing that belongs at the state level? Should anybody have access to this? Should it only be at the hands of the priestesses? And then there's a way to read the early Eucharist as kind of the domestication of an experience that was thought to be so holy and so sacred that you could only celebrate it with trained officiants at a place like Eleusis, or maybe in these outdoor churches that were sacred to Dionysus. And so there's this idea that these magical sacraments are really profound. And there's always been a tension over who deserves access to that. Is there a priestly class? Is there a priestly class who administers it? Or is this a free for all? Should anybody at any time have access to the consumption of divinity?
And that is still alive today. Should there be gatekeepers to the inner sanctum of knowledge that you self reveal to yourself? It is interesting, though, to think that somehow over time it got to be that like the Catholic Church and the people. I would imagine, I'm guessing, at the Vatican they're not doing psychedelics to like gain sacred knowledge. Maybe they are, but it seems like it used to be this. Back in the day, it's like, well, we'll do that, and then we'll get the power, we'll get the knowledge. But what a wild thought. I know Graham would talk about, he thought anyone who had to be president had to do ayahuasca 12 times. And it's like, what a wild thought that the government is like, yeah, that's how that's one of our major powers is potentially psychedelics. It's crazy.
It's crazy. And again, we're talking about the world that we inherited from Greco-Roman antiquity. And we can think about like our political system. We can think about democracy. We can think about the worldwide marketplace, economics. We can think about the codification of law and medicine. We can think about music, which is so important to you. We can think about all the arts and sciences. And they all begin to coalesce at this time, 2,500 years ago, and they're passed on to us. And I like to try and make the point that these skeptical, rational Greeks just wouldn't fall for anything. And so when it comes to the very biggest questions about religion and God and the meaning of life and the nature of the soul and the structure of the cosmos, like they were curious. They were just as curious as you and me and everyone living today. They wanted real answers. And for them, the real answers were available in real experiences, not in metaphor, at places like Eleusis or these Dionysian temples, these revels, these bacchanalia. For them, you had to actually taste something to appreciate it.
I would say that's a human thing. Like we're going through that still today. Um, most people, you have to experience it to really believe it. And maybe that's why a lot of religions feel kind of bereft of any real meaning or depth for people, and people are progressively leaving them because it doesn't, it's just someone speaking to you often with ideas, or you're being asked to take these certain kinds of leaps of faith, literally leaps of faith. And it's just kind of odd to me that the psychedelic experience hasn't interwoven with it more just naturally in the past, because maybe, I mean, like, what do people have against pagans? Why are pagans anti-religion? And maybe it's something to do with like hierarchy and organized structure of religion. It's something about power and trying to control people as opposed to really worshiping God and self-knowledge and self-improvement. Um, you go back to it being a secret for 2,000 years. That's confusing to me. I just want to go back to that because you look at like Lakota Sweat Lodge or an ayahuasca ceremony, a Peruvian tradition. Like the Lakota Sweat Lodge, for instance, they are very, very strict about what songs, how it's done, the timing of the rocks and the doors and the gates. And that's because they see that sort of oral teaching of that container, the technology of that, as the thing they've developed. It's not a secret. It's quite the opposite. It's like it's always the same and it's right there to be experienced. And I could say an ayahuasca ceremony with the Icaros songs the same way. They've been developing these songs and it's the mechanism by which they do the medicine. So it just still confounds me that there wasn't some kind of structure or knowledge about what the ritual was beyond even if there was a sacrament or actual drink, like the actual, like what they did in there. It's like, is there any information about that?
I mean, there's not as much as we would like. I mentioned the hymn to Demeter, which goes back again before classical Athens. I'm thinking largely like 5th and 4th century. So it's centuries before that. And it's the origin myth of Demeter and Persephone. And you get some detail over why Eleusis was chosen as this pilgrimage site, and why Demeter wants these rites celebrated annually. You get a sense of it. And then again, bits and clues from different authors give us the idea of this 9 day and night ceremony. There'd be this procession from Athens to Eleusis, roughly 13 miles northwest of the capital. And there'd be all kinds of jocularity and fun making along the way. You'd get to the temple. There would be an all-night feast, some sacrifices. Then you would drink this potion on your second visit there. So you do all that stuff on your first visit. Then only on your second visit would you be allowed to taste of that potion called the Kukion. Enter the temple with about 3,000 of your co-citizens, and then have this vision, have this experience of the goddess who would come to visit you in some way that was so reliable and dependable time after time. It's just really difficult to explain how that ambiguous detail ultimately results in some kind of life-changing vision. And so like
Yeah.
even very conservative classicists would speculate. I'm thinking about Walter Burkert, for example, who's not controversial at all, as far as I can tell. And even he would speculate that maybe something about everything I just described, maybe it's like it's the Xeroxed copy of some prehistoric drug ritual. And he has this great line in German. This is in 1977 that, maybe what I just described was some festival of immortality that through the expansion of consciousness seemed to guarantee some psychedelic beyond. Now, Walter Burkert is no fan of drugs and psychedelics, but it makes you wonder what kind of echo was happening. So whether drugs were involved or not, there's something archaic happening at Eleusis over those 9 days and nights. That there's something you could say primordial, something that taps into the human condition, and drugs seem to neatly fit in that kind of complex.
Well, there's not enough time in there to do like a 4-day or multi-day fast. I'm trying to think of other things that might have created the same response. I
Well,
suppose.
there were fasting. That's a great point. There was some fasting. They were pretty tired from the march.
Yeah.
It wasn't a full marathon, but maybe half.
Yeah.
So they were tired, exhausted, and when it comes to secrecy, they'd been primed for this experience. So keep in mind that if you went there as a pilgrim, you'd been hearing about this experience your entire life. Like maybe your parents were initiated, maybe your brothers and sisters and cousins were initiated. Maybe this is the thing you heard about, like we hear about Santa Claus coming down the chimney. Maybe this was so normal to you that you went there with the expectation and anticipation of something life-changing about to happen. You've been preparing for years for this. You're exhausted on top of it, and you get there, and maybe that potion did the job, and we don't know what was in it. There's some data to point to something like an ergot-derived alkaloid spiking this archaic beer potion. We don't know for sure what was served up there, or if the recipe even changed, over the years. But something happened to take you in that state of mind and to deliver an unforgettable vision that convinced you beyond any doubt that you would survive for eternity.
Speaking of Santa Claus, and vestiges of the psychedelic past, did you ever look into that and sort of seen how that might, I don't know if it really fits in with the Greeks, but sort of the Amanita muscaria mushroom, Santa Claus, why this sort of the solstice, paganism, is that
Right.
something, was that a subject you explored at all?
Yeah, this is classic pagan continuity. When you think about, why December 25th of all the days of the year? And so
Jesus
if you
born, yes. I mean, what does
and
that
so
mean?
if you look at the sky, the sun dies. The sun certainly, well, in the northern hemisphere, the sun will die on the 22nd around the equinox, and it'll appear to have disappeared forever. But 3 days later, it comes back, and December 25th is the beginning of the rising sunlight to get us through the winter. So it's the darkest day of the year, essentially, and not a terrible time to celebrate the light of the Savior coming back into the world. So there's no biblical evidence to suggest that Jesus was born on the 25th. By the way, these are things that were co-opted by the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church as time goes on. And maybe mushrooms were also part of that. When it comes to Santa Claus. So the Amanita muscaria mushroom, that's that cute little red and white speckled fungus that people have probably seen in Disney movies and folkloric books. John Marco Allegro gets attracted to that mushroom, as we talked about in Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And there's a pretty detailed tradition of the consumption of the amanita in Siberian shamanism.
Yeah.
And there's some pretty good records indicating that the shamans would consume this either directly or through the urine of reindeer.
You
Because
don't
actually,
say. Yeah.
reindeer of all things, like Santa's friends, reindeer,
Coincidence. Yeah.
they happen to be able to metabolize the more toxic alkaloids from the mushroom and pass right through into their urine the better alkaloids, which can then be consumed time and time again, by the way, from different shamans. So there's this whole weird tradition
What?
about urine, reindeer, presents, and Siberian shamanism that could very well influence some of the Santa Claus myth.
I think I don't know how it could not have influenced it, but I mean, how much of a connection there is. It's sort of like I don't know where else that sort of imagery would have come from. Like the guy dressed like a red mushroom with white hats and the reindeer and giving out gifts. It's on that time of the year. It just would be a remarkable coincidence.
Such things do happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just curious here, just to frame this a bit. How does a guy like you learned you're interested in ancient Greek, Latin, Sanskrit? These are not languages that are widely used. So what is it in you that was like, these are the things I want to learn?
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I was reading. This is going to sound like I'm not answering the question, but I am answering the question. I was reading The Hobbit with my daughter last week, and it got me thinking about adventures. And I'm not sure if you remember The Hobbit very well, but Bilbo Baggins does not want to go on an adventure.
Right.
Bilbo Baggins wants to sit at home and just relax and retire into the eve of his life. And Gandalf comes knocking on the door, and all these characters come stomping through, and they're drinking all his beer, and they're coming for his cakes. And sometimes adventure comes knocking on your door. Like I didn't go looking for ancient languages. I was very fortunate to get a scholarship into this Jesuit school in Philadelphia, and Latin was mandatory. And for some reason, it came easier to me than mathematics, so I stuck with it, and then picked up some Greek along the way. So by the time I was 18, I was a classics nerd, and that's I went to college to study classics. Because I liked it, and just because it came naturally to me is the best way to describe it. And I was always obsessed with the notion of being able to read the New Testament in the original language, being able to read Homer in the original, finding about all these mystery rites. And I mean, not to be like obscure about it, but the language does matter. And I started to notice that some things did get lost in translation. Not necessarily about drugs, but when you're reading this stuff in the original, it's to me that was always like the greatest adventure. It always felt like an Indiana Jones hunt from the very beginning.
I think things being lost in translation is actually a really important thing to highlight because there's things like the Council of Nicaea, but then you also think about how translation can change ideas so much and how many times things just like the Bible have been mucked with and translated and sort of interpreted.
I'll
And
give you one, if you want one quick
yeah,
geeky example,
yeah,
I'd be happy to give you one. I mean, as a good Catholic boy, and even if you're not a Christian or a Catholic, you're probably familiar with the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, right? Our Father who art in heaven.
yeah. I
I
know that one from elementary school. I was not at a religious school. We sang it like, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
That's
Yeah,
one.
and it was like, that's how things rolled back in the day. They just had Christian songs as for all the kids. Yeah,
Well,
at
there's
public
my
school.
point.
Yeah,
There's my point. And so
yeah,
there's a line in the Our Father, give us this day our daily bread, right?
yeah, yeah.
Give us the bread. And bread and wine are obviously very big in Christianity. Give us this day our daily bread. Well, daily in Latin is not daily, it's super substantialem, which is super substantial. You could say supernatural. Give us this day our supernatural bread. And in
Mm.
Greek, it's even better. It's hyperousios, which is, again, something beyond the range of a normal condition. So it's pretty much the exact opposite of give us this day our daily bread, which raises big questions that I focus on in the second half of the book. What is Jesus talking about? You know, about the consumption of his flesh and
Yeah,
blood. And I love getting into arguments about this with folks, but that is not Jewish. It is not to deny the Jewish substratum on which Christianity was built. But when Jesus in John's Gospel is talking about eating his flesh and blood, and although we want to assimilate that Last Supper, right? The whole Da Vinci Last Supper, we want to assimilate that with a Passover meal. It was anything but a Passover meal. It's a meal in which this guy is asking his friends to consume his flesh and blood in the most literal way possible, right? So daily bread, as a Catholic, I was taught transubstantiation, which is that it is literally the flesh of the resurrected Christ. And when you consume that flesh, you are consuming God and becoming divine. That is the promise of Christianity. And it's so weird. It's so weird that we often forget like how vampiric and graphic it is to consume someone's blood. But that's the promise. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, whoever consumes my blood has immortality, right? Has achieved some sort of eternal state of being. That's in John's Gospel, chapter 6.
But what if Jesus was talking about microdosing, or he's sort of saying you take a little bit on the regular and it'll help you elevate out of the doldrums of life to understand the numinous,
Right. This is where I get a letter about my heresy. So I don't.
Well, I mean,
we don't know what it, but we don't know what it, that. This is why the language matters, and this is why a phrase like "daily bread." I mean, you're singing it. I was reciting that prayer. Daily bread is not daily. It's well, maybe it is. I mean, maybe it's something you do regularly. We don't know how often Jesus wanted the Eucharist to be celebrated. We really don't know how often that's supposed to be. Today, it's largely celebrated every Sunday. Sometimes more often for some people, sometimes as often as you like, but there's an invitation in the Christian mystery to become one with the divine on a regular basis. And what that means is the consumption of something supernatural, right? I think we need to always keep in mind like how weird that notion is to consume flesh and blood. And I mention all that only because it's a tradition that would have made sense to someone in the first century AD who spoke Greek. And the Greek of John's Gospel is very reminiscent of some of the Greek you can find in Euripides 500 years before that. In the rites of this Greek god Dionysus, who we talked about, consuming his wine was seen to be consuming his blood. So the idea is not new in the first century AD. It's not that weird. As a matter of fact, it fits very neatly into this pattern of theophagy, eating the god to become the god, drinking the god to become the god, and the whole goal being divine communion.
So if you go back into Sanskrit language, is that the earliest known language?
It's probably the earliest written attested form of Indo-European. So, and we don't know how old Sanskrit is, but we do know that there's probably languages much older, and Sanskrit itself could be far older than we know. But it's written down into the Vedas.
Right.
Not too long before that.
So are there clues in there that kind of tie this back into time?
Well, again, sure, because we don't know how old the Vedic civilization is. It could be prehistoric. It could be archaic. We have these written records in the Vedas, and we have very tempting language in Sanskrit. I think it's in Rig Veda 8:43, if I'm not mistaken. It talks about soma, this sacrament, soma. And there's this line like we have drunk soma and met the gods. Essentially, we have attained the light and become immortal. So this concept of drinking a sacrament in order to achieve communion with divinity is present in soma. We don't know what soma was, and there's lots of great speculation on what it could have been.
Mushrooms, yeah.
So you
most likely, very common, yeah.
It was something. It fits into this. It fits into the sacraments. There's a great paper that was written comparing soma, the preparation of soma, and the way it's talked about in the Vedas with the language of this magic potion we've been talking about the whole time, the kukion, which raises questions about the potential association, if any, to the Eucharist. But there is this tradition, this lineage of sacramental potions that give access to heaven, and it's there in the Vedas. And there's some very strong linguistic parallels between the Sanskrit on the one hand and the Greek on the other.
It seems like, as you're arguing, there's a through line through human history of connecting with the divine through some kind of ingestion, and it's certainly here today. I mean, it's not like, oh, this was in the past and we don't know what they're talking about. It's like we have an analogy today, there's many of them, to understand them, cross-cultural. That it seems natural that it would have continued in the past, especially considering that a lot of this stuff literally was just sitting there on the ground. So there wouldn't be, I don't know why people wouldn't experiment. I mean, if they were making beers that killed them, I would imagine they would nibble on various mushrooms and see what happened. And even things like ayahuasca, that's a brew that they had to somehow figure out how to put together all these different plants. And they say the plants told them how to do it. Uh, I see that similarity with this brew they made that you said they had lots of different things in it, and that makes a
Right.
lot of sense.
Right, and these were master pharmacists. Think about it that way. And so we talked about the war on drugs. We talked about like why the reception to my book may be different now versus the 1960s or 70s. And I presented, a lot of this material to the Minister of Antiquities of Greece herself. Her
Yeah,
name is Polixeni Veleni. And because you said one word there that reminded me, I was sitting in her office talking about this crazy idea that the ancient Greeks were doing drugs, and the word that she used was natural. She says, "Well, this is so natural to us." She says, "We're Greek. This is natural. Like if it wasn't happening at Eleusis, maybe it was happening with the oracle at Delphi. Like you went to an oracle before you signed your state constitution
I've
if
seen The
you were a
Matrix.
Spartan."
Yeah, yeah, the Oracle. That's what you do. It's like we know what that means. It's sort of supernatural in its sense, or tapping into another realm.
And there's a possibility that those visions and the oracular prophetess was consuming some sort of psychotropic brew. Some people talk about laurel leaves. She and I were talking about that as a matter of fact. There's a possibility that henbane was involved, one of those crazy solanaceous plants with the tropane alkaloids. And so we can't discount that there may have been pharmacy involved with some of these prophetesses and oracles, and maybe at these mystery temples. And again, the word that she used was natural, natural. And if you think
Hmm.
about it, this relationship between us and the natural world goes back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. The relationship between humans and drugs could predate our species, as a matter of fact. So who knows how old this story is?
Yeah, and so various animals play around with sucking down drugs. Puffer fish and dolphins, I think, and
That's right,
yeah,
pufferfish.
yeah. So I mean, it's out there. It's a thing. So is it true that you did not imbibe in psychedelics? Was it to write this book with clarity and not be biased, or was it more it was a personal decision and you just didn't want to do that in your life?
It's the truth, man. It is.
Mhm.
It is. It is the truth. And the more I think about it, the more my search. I should probably explain. So the book, I call the book the Immortality Key, which is not a psychedelic key. And the key, if anything, that I'm looking for is this you could call it a near death experience. So take the drugs out of the equation. What happens at Eleusis is the practicing of death and the cultivation of this near death state of awareness. You could say the same about the mysteries of Dionysus as well, in the sense that there seems to be this ego dissolving experience where the you that you ordinarily identify with is subsumed into this greater sense of identity, this communion with divine that we've been talking about over and over again. That to me is the key. And when I look at the mystery rituals, when I look at prehistory, and even when I look at early Christianity, what I see is this confrontation with death. And if you were to ask Plato to define philosophy, right, a big subject, he would say that those who practice it in the right way are practicing nothing else but dying and being dead. So, this
Wow.
practice of death, how we relate to death, how we communicate with the ancestors who are dead, and they were called the gods in Greek, the theoi. So once you died, you were no longer human but a god. So communicating with them, having access to them, having access to the queen of the dead, Persephone, the Lord of Death, who could be Dionysus on the one hand, could also be Jesus. In the 3 days between his crucifixion and resurrection, great stories about Jesus harrowing hell, going into the underworld. All these motifs recur again and again and again, and all it is death. It's practicing death. And so the more and more I looked at all these traditions, the key that jumped off the page at me was this near death initiation experience, that is this death and rebirth. And I quote this beautiful line from the St. Paul's Monastery: at Mount Athos in Greece. And in Greek, this tradition is preserved for centuries and centuries into mainstream Orthodox Christianity. It's an Pethanis, prin Pethanis, dentha Pethanis, otan Pethanis. If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. That is the key to immortality, according to the ancients.
But how does that relate to you? Like, why? That's beautiful. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be trite. I'm saying I'm curious why you didn't go down that avenue before, and more importantly, now that you've written the book, I'm confident you've met a lot of people now in the last since that book came out who've been able to hook you up with some
Yeah.
pretty solid experiences. What stops you?
Because when I think about the psychedelic experience, and I read the clinical literature, I'm going to answer your question. To me, it really isn't about psychedelics. And if I see value in them, like for myself and for others, it's in their very reliable way to induce this near-death state of awareness. Now, I will admit I had a near-death experience when I was a child.
Okay.
I was 5 years old, so that's the real answer to your question.
It happened for you already. Yeah.
So something happened to me that I couldn't explain for many, many years. I mean, I still can't explain what happened to me. It was an accident. My older brother hit me in the head with a golf club when I was 5, and I lost lots of blood and was rushed to the emergency room, and had surgery. And it was a strange experience of leaving the body and going into a dream world. And without getting into details, when I started reading the psychedelic literature, I noticed some pretty strong parallels in terms of losing the sense of identity, entering into this other ethereal world, and coming back from that experience with a fresh lease on life. And it doesn't have to be a traumatic incident. Was the biggest insight that came to me when I was researching this book, is that, if psychedelics are valuable, I think there's the potential to recapture some of this ancient magic and mystery for lots of people who don't want to get hit in the head with a golf club, who mainly aren't a natural born psychic or visionary. And so for me, it's actually less about the drugs. To this day, it's really not about the drugs. It's about that state of consciousness and technologies that we could be using, to democratize this sense of mysticism that I think throughout time has transformed people.
Totally. It just one of the things about psychedelics, and we spoke about Jesus said he wanted you to imbibe on the regular, and it was not defined. Maybe that was quarterly, maybe it was weekly, whatever it was. I think a lot of
Quarterly.
people think that psychedelic work is valuable. For some people, quarterly, maybe yearly, maybe even every few years. It's enough to kind of remind them and get into that space. But what's great about them is that you can do them more than once. It's not like you have to have a near-death experience that is dangerous to your body. It's more of just a psychological death, an emotional death. And so in that way, you could have another experience, is my point. And what you went through with the physical trauma is it just that it's quite traumatic, but it's available to people. I think that's what's really interesting about it. We go through these waves in life where we do have powerful experiences, but sometimes we need to get reminded, because we have a lot of information coming at us these days, and a lot of sometimes people get quite down. And so it's a way to shock them back into like, all right. I remember what's important. I know what I want to do. Maybe even clearing out physical trauma, we're starting to find, is something that is useful through psychedelic therapy. So,
and for some people, it could be once.
Very, very true.
If it's not quarterly. I mean, I start page 1 of my book is I'm interviewing this woman, Dinah Baser, who was one of these volunteers in the NYU psilocybin trials.
Yeah.
They were looking at people with anxiety and a terminal illness. So she was suffering from a cancer diagnosis, and from a single intervention of psilocybin, she's turned around, and she talks about it in religious terms and mystical terms, despite the fact that she's an atheist, which I love the language that she uses to describe this. Once in her life, and only once, she says that psilocybin was like being bathed in God's love. And that after being bathed in that love, she was able to appreciate the fullness of life. And she saw so beautiful, like how genuine people were. and she fell in love with her family again,
Yeah.
and her job and life. And I think that's still the case. If you were to ask her, this is, going on a decade ago now. So for some people, it could just be once. And when I hear stories like that, it reminds me of Eleusis. It really does remind me of this culminating experience in a person's lifetime. I mean, psychedelics aren't for everybody. For some people who have the constitution for it, some kind of regular use seems to be therapeutic or beneficial. And then for some people, I would argue, like for a lot of people, maybe, just maybe, a single intervention at the right time in their life with the right support, the right preparation, could transform their worldview and how they think about reality and what it means to be alive in this cosmos.
Totally. So when you were hit in the head, I'm curious, did you get did that also make you like super smart? Was that the thing that like unlocked a part of your brain and like Phineas
that's
Gage or
that's the story going around my family.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't. It's funny. I don't have many memories before 5. Maybe that's part of the trauma.
It
So
just knocked you silly and you just got it just your brain came online like at 20 more percent and you're just using.
something came. Well, I have a hole to this day. So maybe there's some cosmic radiation
Ah,
getting in there.
it's the early form of the chip or something, Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, it's quite a journey there, and I'm just curious too. Like now that the book is out and you've been having all these different conversations, like has your thinking changed on it at all, or you had any different insights about some of the conclusions you came to or questions you posited?
That's a good question. Yeah, and I'll be honest, man. I mean, if you're gonna spend all this time writing a book, what you want to do is be challenged, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I do honestly try and challenge myself as much as possible. And in the afterword to the book, I lay it out there. Here's the data, and it's really 2 pieces of data. I spent all those years trying to uncover, and
Wow.
one piece of data from the second century BC points to something like an ergotized potion. I'm not going to call it an LSD potion, but some kind of ergotized beer in a very Greek temple, domestic chapel in the second century BC. There's hard scientific data that some kind of wacky potion was out there in a ceremony that looks very much like the mysteries of Eleusis. So it's there. We can say with a straight face there's hard scientific data. Um, and then on the Christian side, there is some data from the first century AD. It's the second piece of data that I point to that looks like a wine in and around Pompeii. So where Christianity was certainly picking up some momentum. Wine that was spiked with everything from cannabis to opium to henbane and black nightshade.
Quite a
So like,
brew. Yeah.
well, and also frogs, lizards, and toads.
Why
So
not? Yeah. Little 5-MeO in there. Yeah.
so this stuff existed is the point, and that was not part of this conversation
Hmm.
around pagan continuity for many years. And so like I'm fascinated with the scientific data, but it just raises more questions than it answers is the honest way to talk about it. So like, what does this mean about Eleusis in those 2,000 years? What does this mean about the recipe or whatever was served there, and about Christianity? So even though there's some very witchy wine at the place where it needs to be, at the time where it needs to be, like how do we square the circle? And so I've been having great conversations with lots of different researchers who are a lot smarter than me at leading universities who want to study this stuff. Is the long and short of it. And so I
Mm.
think that if you combine all these different disciplines, you combine the archaeology and the anthropology and the pharmacology and the history and the theology, which is ordinarily not done. But if you look at this problem through that lens, I think that we have a good chance of solving more and more of this puzzle. So if this book is proof of concept for something, I think it's proof of the fact that this part of our history deserves attention, not just in an academic way, but because of what it means to the future of, the future of the society that we inherited from the Greeks and
Well, there you
Romans.
go. If your hypothesis is true, what do you think it means for people today? Like, how would that change or not change someone who is inside one of these religions or not? What do you think the message is for us now?
I think the message is that if, again, as the research continues and as this data plays itself out, the question is, what does it all mean for us? And maybe the answer is we've been here before.
Mm.
And I think that that's a profound thing to say. It's what Terence McKenna would sometimes say. In some ways, the prophet of the psychedelic renaissance. Um, if I'm paraphrasing Terence, he would often say, if you met someone who didn't know where they were between 1995 and 2005, you'd describe them as a fairly damaged person. And yet, who amongst us knows what was happening in Western civilization between 900 and 1400? Who knows what was happening 1500 years ago? And who knows why this illegal cult called Christianity managed to transform the Roman Empire in a couple hundred years, the single greatest cultural transformation in the history of the West? The answer probably isn't psychedelics, but the answer is something that we should pay attention to. And the answer is something to do with these near death states of awareness, something to do with the way we experience death, something to do with that great mystery of which we're a part. And I think, if anything, we should be thinking about the contemplative lifestyle, mysticism, and how we fit into this great historical picture, which is tens of thousands of years in the making. And to the extent that we don't have rites of passage today, that we don't have government administered initiation rites, and instead we have Burning Man, and instead we have the Grateful Dead, like, what would it mean if, in fact, the data shows that these ecstatic experiences were part and parcel of who we were and where we came from? What would it mean to reincorporate some of that technology today?
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I would agree that it seems like it is an important part about becoming an adult. And sort of like Bill Plotkin would say, there are very few adults right now. Maybe 15% of us make it to adulthood. Most of us are kind of stuck in young adolescence, and we don't have these rites of passage that help us presage into being wise and humbled. And I think we need that kind of friction and challenge as a way of
Hmm.
of seeing more than just like what's right in front of our eyes and in our minds. And so we kind of see that reflected in our culture at large, that we're just kind of a bunch of teenagers running the show. And the people who are actually in the government are, a lot of them, the same way. It's more about greed and egotism and short-term goals. So, yeah, we just need to get everybody dosed up and go through a bunch of. We need to really press. Everyone needs to have a near-death experience, and then they'll be nice and humbled, and come back and say, maybe maybe it's about a little bit more till it meets the eye.
Well, there's something very humbling about the psychedelic experience. I don't speak from personal experience, but there's something very humbling about that. Where, again, in this clinical literature, months, years afterwards, people will report being better versions of themselves. Humbled as a result of that humbling,
Yeah,
which comes from the Latin humus, meaning to the ground. And when you're smacked to the ground, and
sounds about
your
right.
worldview can sometimes crumble. And in the wake of that crumbling, maybe you are kinder and gentler and more compassionate and more loving. And maybe maybe that's the missing ingredient to our toxic democracy. Maybe democracy wasn't supposed to be the way it is we practice today. There's a big question. What if at the center of our democracy, some kind of initiatory experience that showed us that we're all somehow connected, that showed us that there's this relationship with a Mother Earth that is not a metaphor, that showed us that there's meaning to the cosmos? I mean, this was essential to the survival of ancient Greek civilization. Then democracy comes later, or democracy is on the periphery. To them, it was not taking what you see with your eyes for granted and realizing there's a colossal mystery to be explored. And I wonder how often we explore that in a safe and methodical way.
Well, we're doing it now mostly through technology and YouTube videos and movies. And I mean, that's sort of our sacrament of the day. And it's really not that deep. I mean, it can do a lot. And even VR, there's a lot we can do to create experiences, but there's just nothing like, frankly, just heading out into nature and having a really amazing hike, experiencing what wilderness actually feels like, let alone these psychedelic experiences. I mean, we're just, yoga. We're talking about practicing for death. That's basically what yoga is. Buddhism. Maybe I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but it could be argued it's about preparing for that moment of death so that you can enter into the bardo properly.
Hmm.
It's all around us. But we're just like a bunch of kids right now trying to figure out why we're so depressed and everything's falling apart. And I think what you're talking about is a really valuable reference point. to think about this idea of rites of passage and what it means to cultivate compassion and how we do that as we grow up into adults. So,
Well, it was part of our past, and if it's part of our past, maybe it belongs here
totally,
now.
man, totally. Well, thank you so much. It's great to get to meet you digitally in person and to dive into your work. And I just think it's fascinating stuff. Is there anything else you might like to add about this before we close?
Just humbling thanks for bearing with me, and for making this happen. I think that the conversation can get wonky sometimes, but it is I think it's super relevant to the state of the world and what lies ahead, not just for society, but for religion and our relationship with death. I think these are the big questions that have always fascinated us. And you don't have to be an ancient language nerd to appreciate that we're, in some senses, we're poised on this mystery, and I think everybody should be investigating it in whatever way we can. And through that investigation, I think that there are answers that will truly help unlock some of the predicaments we're in now.
Mm. Well, Brian, thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir.